So intersectionality, I think, for FIERCE is really foundational, and I think the way in which it kind of positions us not as a mainstream LGBTQ organization is that it's not just about the reality of our identities. So we're queer, we're young, we're transgender, we're gender nonconforming, we're folks of color, we're low income, we're immigrants. This is the reality of our lives, and obviously it is how we see the world, but it really is a lens and an understanding for thinking about the issues that we work on. So the mainstream gay movement, what is the issue of the mainstream gay movement? Marriage, right. Okay, so marriage, it's interesting because they really are building a very mass-based movement around it. This is not just a policy, and there's like thousands of people taking to the streets around marriage, right? And it's actually looking like a more diverse population of people than sometimes we've seen in past mainstream LGBT efforts and movements. Is this an intersectional issue? Is this an issue that is fighting for liberation for all people, or is it creating wide margins of people on the outside of the movement? I would argue that it's creating large margins of people on the outside of the movement, right? So marriage doesn't actually, if we're using FIERCE's analysis, intersectional analysis, marriage isn't actually the issue that gets to what homeless, queer, and transgender youth of color in New York City are needing the most. And it's actually creating a lot of barriers for our communities for fighting for the liberation that we want. So there's an issue around like how we kind of frame intersectionality that's different than the mainstream movement. And I think that FIERCE's work is not to kind of like separate from it entirely or to see ourselves as completely outside of it, but actually like it's sort of sad, but you know, we kind of have to organize the mainstream LGBTQ movement as well as organizing our communities and constituencies. So I think, you know, we're having to have conversations on like how do you move the mainstream movement more left? Like how do you get the mainstream movement to also think about reprioritizing our issues or reframing our issues, while at the same time acknowledging that like, yeah, like it's not okay for there to be, you know, legislation or ballot initiatives that are clearly really homophobic and anti-gay, and like, is marriage the right priority for us to be having as a movement, and is this really leading us towards the kind of liberation that we want? So this is an interesting time. Like, this political moment is obviously a really unique one. We have our first African-American president, and you know, the fallout after the election and the ballot initiatives that passed, with Proposition 8 passing in California, I think like brought back to the surface a lot of the internal issues within the LGBTQ movement. So I think this is also a really big opportunity and time for us to be dialoguing both with folks who've been doing the grassroots work in our communities that have been marginalized historically from the LGBTQ movement and in general because of our experiences of oppression, but really like trying to push each other and having a more critical dialogue around how to use an intersectional analysis in kind of a new, and it's not even a new way, because if you look at the Combahee River Collective statement, I mean, this is not new. Like, they were radical feminist queer women of color talking not just about how race, class, and gender intersected, but also how our experiences are connected to fighting capitalism and imperialism. So this is not new, but I think it's time for us to kind of really challenge the mainstream movement right now and kind of think about like reprioritizing our agenda.
Just wanted to add one thing which Yasmeen was talking about, it not being new. And I think what is new, what I really want to emphasize is the mainstream LGBT organizations beginning to imagine that being queer has nothing to do with police violence, right? That being queer has nothing to do with our material condition, how much money we have in our wallet. That being queer has nothing to do with our mental health, right, with our psyche. It's a real new thing, I would argue, that there's a real separation between being lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or gender nonconforming, and any of the other issues that affect our lives. And I think that one thing that Yasmeen brought up that's really important is we both have to struggle, right, against mainstream organizations challenging us that our lives, you know, exist in single issue ways. But we also have to build, right? So at Queers for Economic Justice and Transforming Justice, we know that it's not enough to just challenge conditions, right? It's really important to make sure that we have access to welfare benefits. It's really important to make sure that trans folks in prison aren't living in violence on a day-to-day way. It's really important to make sure that folks have access to safe shelter, right? Those things are really important. Those are conditions that affect our ability to be present in movements. But it's also important to dismantle, right? And it's also important to build. So what I would argue is that while we're both trying to push mainstream organizations beyond marriage, beyond don't ask, don't tell, things that fit really easily in a neoliberal agenda, right? Where everything is commodified, where your body is based on its value and how much you can earn. We have to do that work. We have to be in conversation, but we also have to really work to dismantle that so that we don't keep pretending that us being queer and us being trans, that the most important thing for us is a marriage or don't ask, don't tell. And we also have to challenge ourselves and think, one of the great things that I think happened with the election in Obama, and I don't think that it's, the end of I don't think now is the time to celebrate our victory, but I do think that leading with vision is something that the left is right now really cohesively doing, right? We're saying this is what we want to build, this is what we want to grow, this is what we want to nurture. And that's so much more compelling and so much more engaging. And that, to me, is about intersections. And that, to me, is about realizing that people live whole lives, and all of our material conditions need to be responded to.
I was saying it so well on that side of the table. Yeah, I was just going to piggyback on what Reina was saying. One of the things that's been interesting for us is that in the South, we still live in the part of the country where there's the most rural space that's inhabited by folks, and there are very, very long rural traditions. And in a lot of ways during this recession, it's been interesting because it's hit the South differently, because we still have a lot of folks who are living on land, who've been farming a really long time, and they're not all white people. There's more rural African American and Latino folks living in the South than anywhere else in the country. And so the kind of fierce and incredible organizing that comes from some of those communities are people who are just like, we are rural people of color who are creating local economies. What do you know about it? Like, they're really thinking about that as those are queer projects. They're like, we want to have an organizing center. We have a couple different clusters of members that are like, we want an organizing center. I was talking to a funder in New York about it, and they were like, yeah, that's just, they really haven't matured to the point of campaigns yet, have they? And I was like, you really don't understand what they're talking about. They're talking about a straight up organizing center where there's like cottage industries coming out of that space, there's gardens in the back, there's like youth political education happening like in the evenings, there's childcare, there's like support for sex workers. I was like, what they're talking about is like totally different economies for taking care of each other. And those are all queer issues. That's, LGBTQ people leading those fights and those struggles.